All right, let's just dive right into this explainer and completely reframe everything you thought you knew about the European Renaissance. Now, when we hear the word Renaissance, we almost always picture a very specific scene, right? Isolated European geniuses hanging out in Italy, painting magnificent masterpieces, and basically single-handedly dragging humanity out of the Dark Ages. But today, drawing on the incredible historical insights from Chapter 1 of the book A Global Renaissance, we're going to look at a completely different, much more historically accurate, and frankly far more fascinating global picture.
Take Hans Holbein's masterpiece from 1533, The Ambassadors. At first glance, it looks like the absolute ultimate symbol of European intellect, wealth, and diplomatic power. You've got these two very wealthy men, surrounded by all these objects of high culture, but nestled right between them is a completely different story. If you look closely at the details, you'll spot Eastern navigational tools, a beautifully detailed Ottoman rug draped right over the upper shelf, and even an Arabic math book. So, it begs a pretty profound question. Was this era really just an isolated European cultural miracle? Or was it the result of a massively interconnected global network that stretched far beyond the borders of Europe, deep into the East and Africa?
Here's our roadmap for this explainer today. We'll cover the myth of isolation, Venice and Eastern wealth, the Arabic financial revolution, the rise of the Ottomans, and finally, the transatlantic dark side.
Okay, part 1, the myth of isolation.
So, the reality of the era was that it was deeply, heavily reliant on global trade. Islamic intellectual tools literally fueled European education in things like navigation and astronomy. Meanwhile, Ottoman imperial power completely shaped European politics. And those Eastern luxury goods, they literally funded the very art we admire today. Europe wasn't defining itself in opposition to the East at all. It was actually building its entire cultural awakening through intense interaction with it. Moving right along to part 2, Venice and Eastern wealth. Think about the sheer imbalance of trade happening at this time. While Europe was exporting basic, heavy goods, things like wood, glassware, salt, and base metals, Venice was pulling in absolutely astonishing Eastern wealth in exchange. We're talking fine silks, exotic spices, precious stones, and these incredibly vibrant crimson and azure dyes. These literal pigments completely changed the color palettes of Renaissance painters. Artists like the famous Bellini brothers used these rich imported Eastern colors to paint their iconic masterpieces. Without the East, Renaissance art would literally lack its vibrant color. But how exactly did they manage this massive explosion of new trade?
Which brings us to part 3, the Arabic financial revolution.
You know the word algebra, right? Well, consider the Arabic term al-jabra, meaning restoring or completion. Introduced by the brilliant 9th century astronomer and mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, it became the literal foundation of modern algebra. It was brought into the European mainstream, alongside Hindu-Arabic numerals, by European merchants like Fibonacci. And why? Because as international trade exploded, merchants absolutely needed these advanced mathematical tools to manage their increasingly complex deals. I mean, imagine trying to run a global trading empire using Roman numerals. It's basically impossible. Before this shift, European systems were stuck with those cumbersome numerals, basic bartering, and really strict religious bans on usury, charging interest. But by borrowing Islamic financial imports, like the numbers 0 through 9, early checks known as bills of exchange, and double-entry bookkeeping, merchants could suddenly calculate credit, track international deals across vast distances, and creatively disguise interest to bypass those religious laws. This financial revolution eventually gave rise to massive banking dynasties like the Medici family, who used all this vast wealth to bankroll the Renaissance itself.
Let's jump to part 4, Rise of the Ottomans. Meanwhile, over in the East, a massive geopolitical earthquake was happening that would directly accelerate European development. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II conquered Constantinople. This positioned the Ottoman Empire as a dominant world power, sitting right smack on top of Europe's main trade routes. But rather than shutting Europe out, Mehmed actively sponsored Italian humanists. He amassed huge libraries of Greek and Arabic texts and even hired Italian architects. By 1520, under Suleiman the Magnificent, this trade, artistic sharing, and cultural exchange had reached unprecedented heights.
You can actually see this cultural synthesis happening in real time. For instance, an Italian artist, Costanzo da Ferrara, painted a beautiful portrait of a seated scribe. Then, years later, a Persian artist named Behzad directly adapted it. It is incredibly difficult to say which aesthetic elements are purely Western or purely Eastern here. It just goes to show a fluid, dynamic cultural exchange where artists were inspiring one another across vast geographical distances.
And that leads us to our final section, part 5, the transatlantic dark side.
All of this frantic economic growth, It triggered a pretty brutal domino effect. Step 1. The Ottomans, controlling the trade routes, placed heavy taxes on overland Eastern goods. Step 2. Desperate to avoid those taxes and keep the highly lucrative luxury goods flowing, Portuguese and Spanish explorers began seeking entirely new sea routes around Africa and across the Atlantic. And Step 3, this relentless, financially motivated European expansion directly led to the devastating exploitation of the Americas, initiating the sheer horror of the transatlantic slave trade. The demand for Eastern goods literally funded these dark expeditions.
Take the Beheim Globe, created by a German merchant in 1492. It maps over 1,100 places and illustrates the intense, growing European obsession with global commercial dominance. Keep in mind, this was created on the very eve of Columbus's voyage, basically capturing a world that was about to be aggressively and violently integrated by European ambition.
As European merchants pushed down the coast of West Africa, trading goods and enslaved people, highly skilled African artisans carved beautiful, intricate objects like ivory salt cellars. These pieces fused African style with European designs. You can even find Portuguese sailors carved right into the bases of some of them. These hybrid items were incredibly highly prized in Europe, representing a literal blending of cultures happening amidst a backdrop of severe exploitation and suffering.
And the horrific reality of this expanding global economy really hits home with one staggering number: 40,000. That is the estimated number of enslaved Africans who were shipped to the Americas in just a 25-year period between 1525 and 1550 alone. They were forced to work in mines and on plantations just to enrich Europe. We absolutely have to remember that the magnificent art, the soaring architecture, and the cultural wealth of the Renaissance were intimately tied to and so often funded by this horrific human cost.
I want to leave you with a rather provocative thought from the 16th century French humanist Michel de Montaigne. He looked at the absolute atrocities committed by Europe in the New World in the name of civilization and penned this quote in 1580. It boldly asks, looking at the devastation left in the wake of all this so-called progress, who were the real barbarians of the Renaissance? It's a really powerful question to reflect on, and for me, it completely reshapes how we view this entire era. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope it leaves you with a lot to think about. Until next time.